And thank you very much for joining us today here for this session on exploring anticipatory financing to address recovery needs. As you know, this is being convened as part of the World Reconstruction Conference, jointly organized by UNDRR, UNDP, World Bank, and the government of Indonesia. My name is Abhilash Panda. I head the work on financing and infrastructure for UNDRR. And I have the pleasure today to welcome my esteemed guests and panelists, whom I will be introducing in a short while. Now, as you would be aware, that anticipatory financing is the latest buzzword in both development and humanitarian circles. As growing evidence base shows, early intervention can provide benefits beyond providing relief from the immediate effect and impact by helping to protect developmental gains in the long run. Acting early mitigates the shock impact and reduces humanitarian needs, helping to protect hard-won gains and enhance resilience. Now, anticipatory action has previously been viewed as a remit only within the humanitarian field. However, we see it has the potential to become a critical connector within the humanitarian development nexus. For that, we need a shift in mindset. Anticipatory action needs to be embedded within the full spectrum of risk. Now, there are some big questions to be answered within the context of anticipatory financing, which my panel members would aptly do it compared to me. For instance, can anticipatory finance be pre-positioned and triggered for other stages of disaster management cycle, say recovery, reconstruction, and rehabilitation? Based on initial success seen so far, can it be scaled up for recovery efforts? For that, we have a distinguished panel of experts from humanitarian and development agencies with us today to shed some light on these pressing questions and many more. We also look forward to hearing from you who are in the room, but also those who are virtually present with us to discuss and promote the use of pre-agreed financing within an anticipatory action framework, which is aimed to directly support recovery efforts. Now, let me introduce my panel members. I'll start with Ms. Crystal Pratt. Crystal has 30 years of policy practice experience in various settings and is currently the Organization of African, Caribbean, Pacific States Assistant Secretary General for Environment and Climate Action. And this organization comprises of 79 member states. I have with me Mr. Matthias Amling, a Senior Desk Officer for Humanitarian Assistance at the Division for Humanitarian Assistance, International Disaster Response and Humanitarian Mine Action of the General Federal Foreign Office. In his current function, he is responsible for the portfolio around disaster risk reduction and anticipatory action. We are also joined with Ms. Aisha Jamshed. She is the Director of WFHHF, if I cannot pronounce it, from Pakistan, as well as the coordinator of the START Network's disaster risk financing initiatives and activities in Pakistan. I'm also pleased to have with me Ms. Kara Siahan. She's based out of Anticipation Hub, which is a Berlin-based institution, and she oversees overall engagement and develops strategic partnership to facilitate learning, guidance, exchange, and advocacy on anticipatory action. I have also my dear colleague, Mr. Ronald Jackson, who heads the Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery for Building Resilience team in UNDP's Crisis Bureau, also the Global Policy Network, and he is also the chair of the International Recovery Platform Steering Committee. Lastly, we are joined by Ms. Quinn Tran from UN OCHA. She's joining us virtually. I hope you'll see her very soon online. Ms. Tran is from the policy branch of OCHA, working on the horizon scanning and leading on the development of policy studies, including on new and emerging technologies and climate crisis. So that's my panel. I would appreciate if you put for a round of applause for them before they start answering to some of your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everybody in the room for being here. I understand you're also conflicting with parallel sessions and messages in that. So maybe we'll start with a few broad questions for my panel members. Let's start with, I'll start with you, Crystal, and Jamshed here. What are some of the success stories of anticipatory action and financing? from where you are coming from, where you sit and where you look at into your countries or in your regions. And what do you see as some of the factors that contribute to this success? Crystal, would you like to come in first?
Is this working? Yes.
It is.
Well, thank you very much, Abhilash. And you sort of stole my thunder a little bit by mentioning that anticipatory financing or anticipatory action is the new buzzword. Because I was really sort of wondering, why was I invited to this panel as the Organisation of African, Caribbean and Pacific States? But apart from our 79 countries, we also have all of the small island developing states, 38 SIDS, and we're in 4 regions in sub-Saharan Africa and then 1 apiece in the Caribbean and the Pacific. So I'll just give you a bit of context as to where I'm coming from. But looking at this anticipatory action financing, I started to reflect on some of the quite major investments that the OACPS and the European Union have been doing over the last several decades, both in climate action and disaster risk reduction. And so there's under the 10th European Development Fund, which was 180 million euro, I started to just dig a little bit into what that particular investment has been able to achieve. 100 million euro was actually given to the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction, which, as we know, the World Bank Group are the trustees for the GFDRR. And underneath of that particular investment, there have been a number of successes, and I'll just share a few of them with you all today. The first was undertaking disaster risk financing diagnostics. And these have been carried out in Mozambique, Senegal, Benin, Cabo Verde, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Sierra Leone. So we can see that, in fact, that particular initiative has been shared amongst many of our African member states. Developing disaster risk financing strategies, which is actually really important as well, provides that foundation for the kinds of financing or risk financing initiatives that one might apply in certain conditions. And so Kenya and Malawi have had disaster risk financing strategies developed. In addition to that, there have been contingency funds set up, as well as contingent loans set up. And so for contingency funds, Malawi, Mali, and Cabo Verde. Contingent loans, Kenya, Mozambique, Madagascar. So what we're seeing is that some of these, and what I'm calling anticipatory financing instruments, are alive and well. There have been agricultural insurance schemes developed for Rwanda and Somalia, Uganda, Malawi, South Africa, as well as in Fiji. And then around sort of safety nets, shock responsive safety nets, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, scalable safety nets in Benin, Cabo Verde, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Sierra Leone, and then costing some of these scalable safety nets for Senegal. But also there have been technical assistance for national level risk information. And again, this really being as important, if you like, as developing disaster risk financing strategies. And so these national level risk information systems developed and for Ethiopia, Mozambique, Kenya, Senegal, Mali, and Cabo Verde, and then also in the Pacific we see these being developed in Samoa, Fiji, and then also the wider regional PIC-RAFI initiative. But there have been also sort of regional disaster risk financing facilities, and these are quite aged now. We have 3 of them. The Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company, and then the African Risk Capacity Group. And so I think that that's another, another example of an anticipatory financing instrument. But as well, there has been contingent credit, and I think we need to look to examples by the World Bank Group and seeing this complementarity with the GFDRR. So with the World Bank Group, their catastrophe deferred drawdown options, the CAT-DDO, And for this, I think it's really come to the fore by being able to release certain resources with certain triggers. And in the case, of course, of COVID-19, being able to release... Okay. I apologise, everybody. And so, with the CAT DDO, if I take, for example, Cabo Verde as an example, they had an approval from the World Bank of 10 million development policy loans with CAT DDO policy financing, and that was approved in June 2019. And it could be used if there is an official declaration of emergency by the government as a trigger. And we did see this being triggered as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And we saw this also occurring with Dominican Republic, with Fiji and a few other countries. And what that does is it provides immediate liquidity to the government to really address emergency response needs. And so those are some of the examples that I've been able to mine out of, quite a rich investment under the 10th EDF. But the successes, I would say that you need to have really trusted and experienced partnerships and partners working with governments. And I think in all of the cases that I've outlined, it has really depended on really trusting past partnerships and long-standing partnerships with governments. But as well as that, I think one of the successes has been the richness of intra-regional learning and exchange, and mainly between South-South cooperation, so between the Caribbean, the Pacific and Africa, and the example being the CRIF, the PECRIC and the ARC initiatives for disaster risk financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crystal, for that. There was a lot of countries that you have mentioned in your remarks, and it's enriching to know that the progress is moving on. And there was a lot you mentioned about the insurance, insurance instruments, but also the role that we need to look forward around partnership building and learning. There was very much of also a regional flavor to it, the Pacific, the African, the island states, and right. So maybe I'll move it to Jamshed here. I mean, she could give us a bit more a context specific in Pakistan's case on what are some of the successes that you're looking at.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity of speaking today. Speaking from the context of Pakistan, it's a country that is facing one disaster or the other throughout the year. So we are always ready for something that is going to hit the communities at any point in time. And I think from that mindset, moving towards an anticipatory early action initiative in Pakistan was very important for us. And the way we approached it in country was we did not think of it as a single initiative by an organization or a network. We kind of approached it more through the systems lens. And when I talk about the systems lens and in very practical steps, what we did try from the onset was to make sure that we begin with the end in mind. We set off from the start to make sure that anything that we do under the disaster risk financing initiative that we have for Pakistan, we are going to make sure at the end of it, everything is localized and all the information material and the scientific hazard models that we have developed are open source and available for everybody to use. I think one of the other key things that has really helped us to move forward at a much faster pace in Pakistan than we were expecting is the way we integrated all stakeholders. I think that has been very important from the start. So this has not been taken in country, again, as an initiative only by START Network or Weltange Helfa. We've had the UN very actively engaged, the government at the national and the provincial level, the National Disaster Management Authority, the provincial disaster management authorities are very actively engaged. We have the local civil society, the international civil society who are also part of it. And most importantly, we've reached out to research and academic institutes in country so that we can scale. I think currently the biggest challenge under all the initiatives that we have is the scalability, which maybe we can talk about later. I think what's most important and interesting for people to hear is what you've been able to achieve, and with the kind of funding, since 2020, when we started in Pakistan under the disaster risk financing project, we've been able to trigger 7 times based on the hazard prediction models that we have. That gave us quantified information on how many people are going to be affected and a time frame based on which the response needs to take place. Most importantly, we've been able to reach out to 9 million people, approximately with a mere amount of $570,000. And if I go in the type of hazards that we're targeting, especially if you look at floods, when we talk about a high-risk response under anticipation for floods, we were able to deliver that to the communities within $7 to $8 per individual. And if you talk about a medium risk for floods, that you can very easily do between $3 to $4. Then if you move on to drought for high risk again, it is somewhere around $7 per individual. And if you move again to medium risk for drought, you can manage between $3 to $4 per individual. Whereas heat wave, which is an emerging phenomena, and Pakistan is facing heat waves continuously since a very long time now. Heat waves, for even the most intensive response, you can achieve under $2. And if you are talking about a medium risk heat wave response, that can be achieved anywhere under $1 to $1.5. In addition to that, I think one of the key achievements or successes that have been there is we've been able to build on what we already had. So we did not really have to reinvent everything that was there in the system. We've been tapping in onto the expertise or onto the knowledge of existing stakeholders. And that has really helped us build the momentum all in all in terms of the financing tool itself. I think the diversity, the understanding of how all of it works, the use of scientific data, and to be able to quantify that at an accurate time, give an appropriate window for operations, and then being able to secure funds so that you have those funds pre-positioned for a response have really helped us to be able to do what we really set out to achieve.
Thank you very much, Jamshid, for that. Scientific data, engagement of stakeholders, localization, open source, but you also mentioned scalability, and you said you'll come back to that with the challenges. So we'll park it for the time being. I want to go to our colleague from OCHA, Ms. Tran, putting the same question. Now we got a context of a country context, but we got a context, regional context. If we keep Africa, Caribbeans, and Pacific together, if Ms. Tran is online with us, I'll put the same question to you. From the perspective of OCHA, you and OCHA, what do you see are some of the successes of anticipatory action and financing? We cannot hear you.
Hi.
Yes, we can
Are
hear
you
you
able
now.
to hear me now?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. So greetings from New York, where it's 2 a.m., so you'll have to, I apologize if I'm a bit slow. So for OCHA, in the humanitarian context where we work, we've been working in places where we're talking about the most vulnerable communities in the most vulnerable context. And where we're looking at really with the anticipatory action right now is where we see climate change as a compounding threat to places where we already work. And so what we really look for anticipatory action is towards how we can move towards early action to mitigate recovery efforts later on, right? So some places where we've already had some success stories, I would say, are with our Central Emergency Response Fund, which is a $450 million fund that allows us to release money quickly for emergencies. And in Bangladesh, for example, the framework that we have forecasted flood and triggered the release of financing, which was the fastest SURF allocation in history. And it provided cash for animal feed, waterproof storage drums, health and dignity and hygiene kits. And some 220,000 people within 4 hours were reached several days before peak flooding. And, you know, there are other examples in Somalia. $15 million of SURF funding was allocated for WASH, health, protection. Ethiopia, again, you know, forecasting framework allowed us to look at drought and really beef up food security for nearly 13 million people. When we look at these examples, what we're really seeing as sort of key to our work is linking the framework to pre-existing funding, right? So that the funding can be released immediately. So having that link to pre-positioned funding is important. And then, of course, as our other panelists have already mentioned, for us in the context where we work, data is really difficult and really important, you know, because that's really what relies on these mechanisms and these analytics. And so for OCHA, we have the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, which really identifies and tackles data challenges, really looking at what data is available, what data we need to work with our partners on in getting so that we can really build a strong anticipatory action framework. And, you know, right now we have several tools to effectively manage data in our sector. The humanitarian exchange language, and we have data grids to help us look at, you know, evaluate and complete data sets that we can use for the future. And finally, I would say the other challenge that we face is really this need to scale up finance for anticipatory action to mitigate that impact down the line, to reduce humanitarian need in the context where we work. So I think quick summary of some success stories and also some lessons that we've already started to learn.
Thank you very much, Ron. Pre-positioning of financing data, and you already mentioned a challenge on scaling up financing, but you know that was one question which I also wanted to go to some of my panelists. Jamshed, you mentioned initially around scalability. You touched upon it. Tran mentioned about the financing or the scaling of finance, but I'm sure there could be other areas which is still need to be looked after to make sure that anticipatory financing moves up in scale and it's used across many frontiers and countries. So maybe I'll put the question on the challenges on in scaling up anticipatory action and financing to Matheus and Kara and Jamshed on for this question. Would you like to start, Kara, here?
Hello? Yes, thank you. And I just want to, again, really capture what has been said by Aisha before about the successes of anticipatory humanitarian action for us in the humanitarian sector. We have now over 70 countries implementing anticipatory action, from the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, from the UN, and of course from NGOs as well. But it's true what also Aisha said, it's difficult to change minds. Mind shift is tough. I'm going to quote actually the data from the START network. About 55% of crises are somewhat predictable, but only 1% of financing is actually organized in advance. And despite of the growing number of organizations and countries implementing anticipatory action, we still have those barriers. One of the barriers is, of course, the mind shift itself. Second is the fragmentation of planning and financing. I think if we really want to build a system that translates early warning into early action, where financing is also pre-agreed, we need to look at the system end to end. But we are seeing in reality that very often forecasters or those who are talking about the science are only talking in their language and not really translating to what it means into humanitarian action, for example. We also see the fragmentation of programming also between government budgets. If we talk about financing, yes, we have the humanitarian pools such as SURF, such as the WRC5 Disaster Relief Emergency Fund, but those are the fuel for financing, whereas for systems building, we also need money from the development and the climate sector for those early warning capacities investment, organizational investment. The third is impact before instruments. A lot of the times when we are developing these financial instruments, organizations or specialists really focus on the technical aspects, the novelty of an approach, but less so about what it means for human impacts, whether we are really tailoring the instruments based on the impacts we want to reach for those who are in need ahead of disasters, and in a context where it's appropriate. So those are the three challenges, I would say.
Thank you very much, Kara. I'll pass the floor to you, Mateusz. I mean, I'm sure there are other things that you would be adding to this conversation and the challenges side.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have the pleasure to really talk after many people who do a lot on implementation and work a lot on anticipatory action. So I'll give a list of challenges I believe we have to tackle, but you will recognize many things that have been said already also. So I think first of all, it's very important we see the rising humanitarian needs, we see climate change impacts, that we do the scale-up. And scale-up can be horizontal and vertical. Horizontal to really have more countries even. We hear it's 60, even more hazards, but also vertical to just reach more people, protect more people against these hazards. And then for the scale-up, I believe 5 things are really important, 5 main challenges. We have to build systems, that's first. We really have to build these protocols. We have to have operational capacity on the ground to deliver anticipatory action. That's very crucial. We don't need the anticipatory financing if we can't use it. It's kind of, we don't need the fuel without the engine. That's crucial. The second one, strengthened data. We heard about that data, early warning systems, forecasting mechanisms. I think that's where we build up. That's why we can do anticipatory action, because forecasting and predicting gets better. But we have to improve this, and sometimes also improve granularity, so that we do not only know for like a country or a bigger region what happens, but really know what happens in a specific place to be able to do the anticipatory action in the right way and use it as we heard about that a lot in these days, impact-based forecasting, not what will happen, what kind of weather, but what is the impact of it. Then the third thing is the fueling, is the financing that we talk about. We heard about different ways of using pooled funds, the SURF, the DREF, the START network, all of them mentioned already. We can also think about other ways, other financing potentially that anticipatory action can tap in, climate finance and these questions. I think it's very important to broaden our perspectives a bit in that, but we need to fuel anticipatory action. Without financing, nothing is happening. We need to mainstream, that's number 4, in our own organizations. Everyone, for me in the Federal Foreign Office in Germany, we have to mainstream this thinking, for others in their organizations, but also, and that's why I'm very happy to be able to talk here, throughout our different communities, not only the anticipatory action community, not only the humanitarians, but really use this thinking, which is a quite intuitive thinking, to act ahead of something getting broken or being worse. So, and number 5, I think it's really important also what we do now, exchange, learn, build evidence, and really also, I say it every time, embrace failure, see where we are not good, and getting better in doing that. And I think such a conference is good for that, but also my colleague from the Anticipation Hub can tell much more about how we need these networks to really get into all of that exchange. And I would shortly, I see time running up, mention 3 things specifically that we did in the last year, I would say, as the German Federal Foreign Office. One thing, I think, on policy level, we have a very productive time at the moment. From last year, September, a high-level event where we had 75 UN member states acknowledging the anticipatory action as a concept, 60 big organizations from the UN, from civil society. I think that was very important. Just now, the last month, with the German presidency of the Group of 7, we managed to discuss and then also implement, or not yet implement, we have to do that, but finalize a G7 statement on strengthening anticipatory action. I think that's a very important step where we say, or all the G7 foreign ministers said, we have to have a humanitarian system as anticipatory as possible, and we are willing to significantly increase our financing to enable that. And I think we can build on that for the coming year, or looking up to the next COP maybe. And then the Build and Fuel Germany, ourselves at the high-level event, we committed up from next year to use 5% of our humanitarian budget in an anticipatory manner. It's not yet matching 20% or 50% of things that might be possible, but it's a significant increase from where we're coming from. And I think that's important to also give some targets to ourselves. And lastly, talking about the data, we also together with OCHA, with the UN, with other partners, launched this complex risk analytics fund. It's a fund that will help us to support a data ecosystem and quality data that we can then use for better anticipation, which leads to better anticipatory action.
Thank you, Matthias. I think the G7 statement was definitely very encouraging and puts the issue of anticipatory financing up above all the discussions. And it's welcome to hear that you're increasing from 5, going towards 5% and then gradually to 20-25%. This is definitely a welcome news. I'll come to you, Jamshed. Now, you mentioned scalability, but there was also the issue of financing, which I think partially Matthias has tried to answer from Germany's perspective. But off to you on the scalability issue, and what are the other issues that you have come across?
I think the first would be the mindset. Overall, the civil society or the way the system is structured is reactive to emergencies. And I think that change in mindset, that is a real challenge when it comes to moving to scale, because you need to think proactively and preemptively when you're talking about anticipatory response. The other would definitely be the shrinking space. And when I talk about the shrinking space, it's not just the operational shrinking space, it's about funding. And it's about people trying to reinvent the wheel for a similar cause over and over again. I think what's really required is that resources and capacities are pooled. That really needs to happen. What is also a major challenge is organizations not always sticking to their mandate. Where there is duplication in roles, I think a lot of confusion and a lot of duplication in resources is also taking place then. Especially if I speak about the context of Pakistan, there has to be a very clear line where the UN does not come in direct competition with the civil society. And I think that in itself is a very big challenge that needs to be addressed. In addition to that, I think we talk about lack of capacity all the time, or I like to think about capacity sharing, not about building, because it's always a two-way process. But when you're talking about capacity sharing, what is the end line on capacity sharing itself, and when does that actually start to translate into action? I think that very clear line also needs to be drawn and seen. In addition to that, I think there needs to be flexibility from donors, especially when you're talking about pooling funds and you're talking about scientific triggers. You have to be aware that there is a high chance that not all your funds are going to be used, or they're not going to be used entirely for the same purpose you initially earmarked them for. So I think that kind of flexibility and understanding from donors needs to be there, so that funds can be rolled over. They can be used for a different kind of emergency when we are looking into it. And what exactly would be the timeline for them to translate into insurance in the end. I think those kind of systems really need to be looked into and worked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamshed. I think what I can complement here, which is not going to make much of difference, but listening to all three of you, there is quite a bit of similarity with the disaster risk reduction discussions also. The same issue of mindset shift, the same issues of capacity and sharing, the same issues of mandate, but it's more siloed in certain cases. But anyway, that was my 10 seconds of trying to pitch in something. But from here, maybe I'll bring a bit of discussion back to the content of the topic, right? The recovery efforts. Now, how can we how can anticipatory financing directly support recovery efforts? I think that's something that we may want to explore a bit more. But what would need to apply the foundational principles and lessons learned from applying anticipatory action in the early action phase to the recovery phase? So in this case, I'll start with you, Ronald. UNDP has been in the front on recovery, so maybe there is something that UNDP may want to bring forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Abhilash. Let me, like Crystal, start by saying, for me, anticipation is at the heart of disaster risk reduction. And if we even reflect on the stated objectives of anticipatory action, it speaks to scale up and mainstream anticipatory action as an approach across disaster risk management and climate change adaptation frameworks, plans, and approaches. Scaling up requires dedicating more funding to expand and strengthen local capacities on anticipatory action. It means expanding geographic coverage and types of hazards that can be anticipated. That's risk reduction. Yeah? And it goes on. So the best anticipatory approach is prevention and/or mitigation. And why? It reduces the resources that are going to be required after the event, after the trigger. So one of the best ways then to be able to meet financing needs is to not have to be able to deal with it by anticipating and acting in a different time scale. So there are some inherent principles here. Time factor, here where we look at actions that happens in anticipation of the hazard itself. Actions to prevent, mitigate, or the predicted impact based on a forecast or a collaborative analysis. And here I want to bring in this notion of protecting hard-won gains. Now, protecting hard-won gains there are two phases of that. There's the sort of longer-term development interventions that need to be happening before a crisis, and then there is the interventions that need to happen at, I would say, D-3, if you were able to anticipate the event, or D+1, to protect those hard-won development gains. And I think that is where, we talk oftentimes about this interface between humanitarian and development, right? Bringing it back to that. And then the third principle that comes out of this is this issue around prearranged financing, something that is required to secure timely action. And here, we're really talking about ex-ante arrangements, not just from the point of view of national governments and how they look at their budget allocations, or as Krista said, looking at a range of measures pre-arranged to be able to deal with the extent of the losses that they're going to see. So from that, if we focus on these principles and these ambitions, can we organize our recovery financing well ahead of time? My answer to that is absolutely. There's adequate data in country. There's knowledge of the antecedents to the crisis that when matched with the analytics and foresight tools, we can provide greater decision intelligence that will allow us to be able to come up with the necessary scenarios, to cost those scenarios. And in fact, in my home country, Jamaica, working with the World Bank, we came up with, in the order of magnitude of billions, somewhere I think around $12 billion in terms of what we need to anticipate as financing needs if we had singular or cascading events. And to support that, they've looked at issues around CAT DDOs, around contingent credit facilities, around insurance, as well as what are the longer-term ongoing budget needs. We can do more with the ability now with data to be able to price and prepare for our recovery financing and to have those anticipatory arrangements in place. So in the short term, from my lens, some of the foundational principles we may want to leverage from the anticipatory side is higher risk thresholds for the institutions. Are we as UN institutions, governments, donors, willing to make those types of decisions around when we allocate financing in the ex-ante context and to release those financing at D-3 to allow the development actors to be able to protect those development gains? It needs robust decision-making mechanism to be able to act on the scenarios, recognizing that they are not necessarily we're dealing with non-linearity, so we may not predict precisely the outcome. And third, it is based on the presumption of coordination and networks that must act together. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. How do we prioritize work across? And you heard that coming across this red thread from the past panel and this panel. So we're looking at 2 time scales. There's much more I could share, but I know I'm out of time or coming to my time closure here. But I really want to play up this point around the need for us to look at the financing from not just a short-term, event-centric context, but how we now begin to match the capabilities now to bring better decision intelligence, to organize financing ahead of time, including set-asides for short-term.
Thanks, Ronald. 3 specific principles, right? Time factor, protect hard-won development gains, pre-arranged financing, or robust decision-making. Crystal, would you have anything to add to this?
Yes, I do.
Cara has something to add to it.
On the solution, basically. So I think I really agree on what you said, Ronald, about having this really embedded. It is disaster risk reduction, indeed. And we need to make sure that new approaches that we build, whether it's anticipatory action or other anticipatory approaches, let's say, for different programming, is really developed in a way that is humble. You don't make it seem like it's a silver bullet approach, because this is when we lose basically the audience. We are now coming after, again, 70 countries, having to again explain that yes, this is part of disaster reduction to some of the, let's say, audiences. It was innovation maybe 7 years ago, but we have to understand that this is part of disaster reduction. I would like to emphasize on the need to fall forward. The learning that we have captured in our community really help us to adjust and adapt our methodology to fit better contexts, to also design better actions. So for us at the Anticipation Hub, what we are doing is really collecting, producing, and curating those evidences, databases on trigger and early action. And that's why also we need to be better at also attracting the unusual suspects, because of course each community is often very comfortable in, speaking in our echo chambers, whether we are talking about finance or humanitarian. A lot of the solutions that have been developed through anticipatory action really came together because this holy triangle of practitioners, scientists, and policymakers work together to develop design in this co-creation approach. So this is what I would like to emphasize.
Thank you, Cara. Thank you very much for that. I guess Ronald wants to comment on some of these things, but before that, Crystal, you wanted to add something.
Really to say that I agree with everything you say, Ron. But I just wanted to make one point, which could be a challenge or an opportunity. And I would say that we really need to embrace risk management considerations as an underpinning imperative right along the value chain of sustainable development and resilience building. So I had written that down. So as you were speaking, Ron, it was really very much music to my ears, because I think that we have to really stay focused. But we must not see disconnects between humanitarian assistance and development. Thank you.
Completely agreed. Ronald, off to you.
Yeah, no, just a very short comment, because I think, I come from a practice where it's been limited by a number of other variables, right? The political economy of management of risk. And I just wanted to say, whilst I'm a firm believer that anticipation is at the heart of risk management, the humanitarian actors must be commended for really illuminating the application of the tools that are inherent in this particular practice. And I think that is where we've struggled. We've struggled nationally, we've struggled even within the UN system. Going as far back as my national role, we were trying to use it. It didn't require digitalization and technology to use crude methodologies and tools to crunch the numbers and to get a sense of what the implications of a particular impending threat would mean, not only from a response point of view, but what did it mean for us in terms of the rebuilding journey ahead. But we've never tapped into that type of capability in many of the developing world per se, until this conversation around anticipatory action or forecast-based financing came in. And there were great resistance towards it. But what it did, it was just that it told us, look, we have the means to be able to do this. We have as UN organizations operating in many countries, we have the ability to match decision intelligence with our intelligence on the ground. We work with the government, we work with the communities, we know the antecedent conditions. And there's a lot that can be generated from this rather than a short-term focus if we're able to scale up our actions. I just wanted to really just add also a voice of commendation, even though as I promote a much broader risk management approach.
Thank you, Ron, for that. I do have my own set of questions which I can continue on, but I definitely want to give an opportunity to our colleagues on the floor, and if they have any questions to any of our panel members. I have 1, 2, and 3. So maybe we have 1, 4 here. Can we have a mic here, please, to the first row, the third row, sorry. It's coming from your left.
Thank you very much. This is Ari from UNDP Bangladesh. And I fully agree with Ron in that way. I have some similar experience in Bangladesh. Like, we have a numbers of polders. And cyclone is one of the big source of the disasters. But you observe that, like, we have a big projects for reconstruction of the polders. It will need $30 billion. But it will need 25 years. But what we have the risk information, like some sort of anticipation, early action, forecast-based, risk inform. So what we are finding that there's huge opportunities. Like, as we know the risk, so we can identify where there is a chance of bridging an embankment or a polder. So if you can target it from the early financing or forecast-based things, we can save a lot. So I think this is an opportunities where we really can target in that way, where is the risk is that, and some sort of a preparation like recovery, as you mentioned earlier, this is the bridging, how we can match with for the humanitarian development nexus in that way. So I think Bangladesh can be a big example for that, how we can match these anticipatory actions towards the recovery and saving a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arif. No, it's a very, very interesting comment, right? In just what he's trying to say is there's a lot being spent on recovery and takes years to make. But if we had infrastructure in place which could have reduced the impact, there could be a lot of savings and continuation. And that was what Ron was commenting on. But any reaction from the panel members, anything on that? It was not a question, it was just a comment and a success story, right? If not, I had one hand at the back, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Rajendra Arya. I am from FAO delegation. First of all, thank you very much to all the panel members. This has been really interesting discussion. Also, thanks to the colleagues from OCHA. I mean, I'm someone who has been working on the ground for the last 20 years on the humanitarian settings, both sudden onset and slow onset. When it comes to financing instrument, I mean, we have been working very closely with SURF or country-based pool funds, which is pretty efficient. But if we look at the need on the ground, I mean, they definitely provide seed fund, but it's not enough. At the same time, I have seen the World Bank, managing or administrating the trust fund, and it's very interesting to listen to you when you say that you have managed to establish this contingency funding in some of the countries as a soft loan. The problem is that it's not necessarily that the government would be in a position. I mean, I'm not generalizing it, but there are instances where the NGOs are probably more effective and more efficient and quicker, or the UN agencies are more efficient and quicker to implement the things. So in order to get the money right at the time, reaching out to the right people at the right time, at the right place, you might need to have some sort of like fast-track procedures. It's not necessary. I have experienced that the bureaucratic procedures are so cumbersome, and there's sort of like no easy means for the agencies on the ground to really access those funds. So now I also see someone sitting from the donor side, from the German side. Is there a sort of like a way that you are also thinking in innovative in terms of innovative financing, that this type of trust funds, which is actually a huge amount of money, could be made more flexible so that these agencies working on the ground could have direct and quicker access? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe, Matthias, we take one more question together and then. I think the lady in front had a question. Could you please? And I'll come back to you, sir. I'll come here also.
Thank you. I am Margi Siregar from World Vision. So my question will be, in your experience, how do you include the gender equality and social inclusions in the financing mechanism? How do you communicate to the groups about the access and availability of this contingency fund for their purpose also, for the social inclusion, for people with disability, for the women who are actually in the risk of this disaster, who are affected by this disaster. Thanks.
Thank you. So maybe, Matthias, you want to take the question first on innovative financing model, and the second question was not specified to anybody. So any panel member who would like to take it, please feel free. Matthias, please.
Yes, thank you very much for a very good question around funds, flexibility, and so on. I think there are different layers to a question, maybe. First, I want to come back maybe to something that we discussed before, also on the time frames of funding. And I believe we have to understand a bit that the one thing is to have funding predictable and to decide, so to pre-arrange financing. And the other question is when to trigger it and be able to use it. It's not the same thing. You can pre-arrange financing and then using it after the fact for recovery, like a normal insurance usually does it. But you can also try to have it ahead of the disaster to already prevent, mitigate, which would be more in our line of thinking around anticipatory action. But that's just kind of thought that fits then to the question around what to do with the funding. Basically, from my ministry's perspective, we are dealing mainly with humanitarian things. So I would tell you, yes, we encourage, for example, country-based pooled funds to do more anticipatory action, but also give quite a significant amount of our funding to the SERF and the CBPFs, which are the CBPFs at least like accessible for NGOs. But as you said, it's not big enough. The scale is the question. And in another of our ministries, currently also in the G7 process, the development ministry, they discussed with their fellow partners to build on what is known the Intro Resilience Initiative and their targets, and to build something that they call, or build towards something that they call the Global Shield, which then would try to use different things like the World Bank, the Intro Resilience fundings, and just enhance protection on a bigger scale to many people against climate risk and disaster risk, I would add. They normally say climate risk, but in the end it will be both, I guess. So I think we have to try to do everything, try to get bigger scale. That is sometimes just also not always usefully accessible by a small NGO maybe. But we have to have this bigger scale funding in insurances, sometimes also not ahead of the disaster, but really after the disaster to help the recovery. And we have at the same time to have funding ahead of the crisis and funding for small organizations accessible as directly as possible and as flexible as possible. And I think we always need a feedback on that, and we, on our side of the donors, have to work on providing the best funding possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. Very helpful. So who's taking the question? Shimshid, please.
I think the response to your question would be localization. And I term that in one word. When you talk about making sure that gender is integrated, you're talking about inclusion. We have to give communities credit to understand their own needs and the responsibility that they're able to make sure that people in their community, especially women, when it comes to people with different abilities, they are able to identify what is going to work best for them. And the way that we work, especially in country, is that contingency plans are developed by the community. So when they're developed by them, that means that automatically all their needs are addressed, what they want, what they think works best for them, and that is something then that is absolutely doable.
Ron, you want to comment a bit?
Yeah, I just want to give two quick comments on the last questions, and I hope I understood it correctly. You were talking about different entry points for delivering on recovery. I think the gentleman at the back there, he talked about civil society or local groups who could act faster. And for me, they're just, the key around this approach is always about principles. The principles of harmonization, coordination, and no duplication. And I think Jamshed mentioned some of these, in her comments around what she saw in the Pakistan. And then also what context, what are the contexts we are operating in which dictates what approaches we may need to, or mix of approaches we may need to take in that regard, recognizing that recovery is not a short-term intervention. So short-term interventions based on the entry points need to be seen as foundational for the medium and long-term investments on recovery that will take place. And then for our colleague who talked about how do we factor in gender and other issues, for me, this is where we get into the sort of institutional systems that are facilitating inclusion in our analysis. So we're looking at our population in a truly inclusive way, and we are engaging the population up front. As I said before, with better understanding data, etc., we're able to engage communities at risk that are likely to be impacted by a range of hazards, whether they are natural or otherwise, and to have this discussion around, if it happens, what will your specific needs be, and how might we work together and co-create the pathways forward. There's a lot we can now do. We don't have to wait until after the event to begin to engage the communities on recovery, discussions and recovery planning. Just some quick reflections on the question.
No, thank you, Ron, for that. I have three more hands up. So I'll take the sir there and then we'll come here, and then there's one more hand there. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Bolter of Banyania. Thank you for the good reflections and the very nuanced debate, and also in particular to the colleague from New York for staying up so late in the middle of the night. The only good disaster is the one that doesn't happen. I think we can all agree on that. So that means that a hazard event does not overwhelm local capacities. And for that reason, I think we should all be advocates of community resilience, resilience more generally, and systemic risk governance. The latest Global Assessment Report is very strong in this aspect. I think that anticipatory action and financing has a lot of potential and can reach scale, but only if it is embedded in that systematic risk governance. And I think this has been listed as a challenge by several of the panelists. I would say that if we look at heat waves, for example, heat waves is an aspect that will lead to a huge increase in fatalities in the 2030s and onwards. Of course, there are some issues that we can deal with through anticipatory financing and action. But things like white roofs, green roofs, urban forests, and the like are other things that are very, very important to reduce the risk from people dying. So I think the homework, and maybe you have ideas on how to reintegrate anticipatory action and financing into the broader umbrella of DRR. At the moment, what I see is that we run the risk of creating sub-silos, and I think we all would like to avoid that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I'll just take two more, and then we'll combine. Can you have the mic here, please? On the this.
Good afternoon. My name is Nadia Haddad. I'm from the European Disability Forum. We had done a review about 55 countries in Europe and East Pacific, Asian. And the biggest concern also when it's about recovery funds is there was a lack of disaggregated data before the disaster, before the COVID, and also after. So it will be very important to invest in data, besides invest in meaningful participation of all middle society organizations, but also about investing in trainings for those who planify recovery plans within it, to take into consideration the most vulnerables in the society, and to realize really the nothing about us without us, and also the leave no one behind. Thank you. I don't know if in any of your institutions you already planned to do some trainings to the staff about it, and also to do it on different levels. That's not only on international level, on global level, but that the impacts come back on regional level. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I had a hand here. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Rachel from the Philippines. Thank you for the very interesting panel. Actually, the Philippines is about to start institutionalizing the anticipatory action. So my question is addressed to our colleague from Pakistan. In the development of your robust data, how did you qualify or quantify vulnerability? Does it only include socioeconomic status or among others? Because we need to emphasize how science guides our decision making. And the second question is addressed to any of our members in the panel. Is there an inherent link in anticipatory action and pre-disaster recovery planning? And how can you elaborate on avoiding the silo mentality between response and leading towards early recovery? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there was one more hand there at the back. Please, could you please transfer?
Hi, I'm Kai. I work with the African Union. Well, when it comes to issues of financing, this is one of a very complex and progressive discussion we have back home in Africa as well. In 2012, the African Union established the African Risk Capacity. Today, even recently in Madagascar, the agency has paid a payout about $10 million. But still, this comes after a disaster. So the discussion we have at the moment is also in line with the panelists' insight, is how do we ensure that such financing is triggered before a disaster? And as we all know, even predicting a hazard, it still has a lot of uncertainties. And some of the regions are not at the same level. So in many African countries, forecasting and hazard detection is still a big challenge. And therefore, pre-positioning or pre-financing in line with these uncertainties is also proving to be a big challenge. So a lot of work really needs to be done in ensuring that we understand vulnerabilities. We have concrete and reliable data that will ensure that such kind of pre-financing really address the real needs, because otherwise we'll be investing in short-term pre-financing, and at the end of the day, you don't have that disaster, and that will create lack of trust.
Right.
So, yeah.
Thank you for that question. Now, we are absolutely above our time allocated. What I'm going to do is I'm going to merge these questions a bit so that we get also sort of your last concluding comments on this in itself. So there is one common question which is coming on the data, disaggregated data, lack of disaggregated data, and also the data which is required for forecasting because of the uncertainties. So maybe is there anybody in our group who would like to take this question up? We also have our colleague from OCHA on the line at 2 a.m. in the morning. So Tran, you have all the time that you want to take. Just intervene. Anybody on the data question? Jamshed and Ron. Maybe Jamshed, do you want to go in and then we'll go to
I think when it comes to data, we are all very, most of us are very eager to point out that there's a lack of data when we're talking about it, and I would like to disagree there. I don't think there is a lack of data. There is a wealth of data that is available. The only gap that is existing is how that data is merged, how that data is shared amongst various stakeholders, and how do you make best use of it. The problem here again is that we tend to reinvent the wheel over and over again. We are saying there's a gap in data. That data is available. You only need to gather what you really need and do the analytics over it. And I think with all the information that is already there, not a lot needs to be done when it comes to the analytics on it. When you talk about how you're going to interpret data, it really depends on what works best for you in your particular scenario. What kind of triggers are required for you to be able to respond best to the needs that are arising from the community? So again, I'd say it's more about the coordination and data sharing than saying that there is existing gaps or there is a dearth of data that is there.
Thank you, Damshay. That was completely spot on. There was also a related question on training and capacity building of the most vulnerable and groups in that. Ron, you want to say something on that, or maybe other panelists and Kara?
Yeah, just quickly to say, love your reflections on the data issue. And I was going to say, we oftentimes get confused with not thinking through data for who and data for what. Yeah, and sometimes we don't need more than 3 data points to be able to be very clear on what the action needs to be. But you've said everything very well, and I ditto. On the disabilities and inclusion, I fully agree with the comments from the speaker. Certainly in our organization, through our LNOB guidelines internally, we're looking at how we're treating these particular issues, both in terms of the capacity building of our staff, but also how we are looking at program guidance within UNDP. But we've gone a step further, and we have kicked off internally, well coordinated through our various bureaus, a clear focus on disability inclusion. And we're developing specific or expanding guidance tools, and we have one on disaster risk reduction and looking at disability inclusion in terms of our programming and our support. Involves training of our staff, but also how we roll that out to engagement at field level. Yeah.
Thank you, Rob. Kara, please.
Thanks. I just want to complement what's already been said. Just also a plug, I would say, because if you are really interested into looking at how data is used for anticipatory action, please do check out our resources, because we have really a wealth of resources coming from case studies, coming actually from triggers that are being developed by different organizations for different hazards, and also databases on evidence. So if you want to see how data is being used, please check out our resources. For training and capacity building, the same. We have tools, guidance material available on the Anticipation Hub. Anticipation Hub is again hosted by the German Red Cross, and we convene more than 90 organizations coming from different UN, the Red Cross, a lot of academia and think tanks as well working with us. So if you are keen on also providing input, because that's what we want to know, we are now working also with governments at national level to see what kind of training and guidance needs. So please do reach out to the Anticipation Hub if you're interested in contributing and also requesting. Thank you.
Thank you. There was one more question which I'm also combining. There were 2 different questions which I'm combining. One was, how do we reintegrate broader the anticipatory action in the broader disaster risk reduction discussions, and how do we break the silos that are currently out there? So Crystal, Matthias, anybody want to go on this? Please do.
I actually would try to say very shortly on 3 things.
All right.
Comment first, maybe on the question around African risk capacity and triggering. I believe, if you have parametric insurances, so that don't need the indemnity to pay out, you can trigger them ahead of a disaster and can use them for anticipatory action. And the African risk capacity is an insurance, sovereign insurance that did this already, also with a replica product that actually for NGOs and for the WFP did a similar thing that then connected with the government contingency plans and the NGO or UN contingency plans. So I think that's kind of a best practice that we can learn from. Then on the disability inclusion, I couldn't agree more, and I think it's important that we have to learn, like in a lot of these areas where we work now, we have to learn and get better. And I'm very happy in another session today, we discussed also with colleagues from Humanity and Inclusion, and they run one project at the moment financed by our Federal Foreign Office that is trying to, let's say, inclusion-proof the early action protocols and plans that we already have in place. So to really try to have this disaggregated data and to have a look at the experiences that we make with anticipatory action and if they are disability inclusive or not, and where we have to improve. And then lastly, and then coming to what I was asked to talk about, the silo question. One thing I took away from our whole discussion, and I really liked, Ronald, your comment as well. Yes, DRR is doing and thinking in that way already much longer than anticipatory action ever existed. And I'm happy if anticipatory action gave another input on that and created some energy and dynamic in rethinking. But it is still a part of DRR. It is not. It's nothing. There is no need for any silo. It's not like an early warning system silo exists. It's in the end one way of doing. It's not all disaster risk reduction is anticipatory action, but anticipatory action is an element in disaster risk reduction, and therefore I think that's very important to understand. And even though it happened to be started in the humanitarian community, and I think still it's also important that we have it, because we would want to live in the total resilient communities and societies, but we always have residual risk. We always have the situation where something is just stronger than we could have prepared for in the long run, did disaster risk reduction in the long run. So we still have the capacity from the humanitarian side, not just because it's humanitarian, act after the fact, but still act ahead of the disaster. But at the same time, yes, the more it can get the anticipatory action thinking and methods and instruments can get integrated in all DRM systems of national DRM systems, regional DRM systems, plans, and so on, the better and the more resilient we'll be before we need any humanitarian anticipatory action. And I think this is where that's why it's great to be here and talk to this community, and where we all have to interconnect and to learn and to get better, to have this as an integrated and comprehensive system that was not me.
That was not you.
That thinks anticipatorily.
Thank you, Matthias.
That was a sign to cut.
Thank you, Matthias. I'll give the last 30 seconds to Tran. She has been online at 2 a.m. Tran, was there anything that you would like to compliment here to all the questions that you heard or your panelists?
Thank you very much, and what a privilege to get the last 30 seconds. I think really for OCHA, what we're seeing is this ever-increasing need, right, and humanitarian need. And the only way we can really bring down that need is to do life-saving activities at the same time that we do resilience activities, right? And so, as we increase our humanitarian capacity, we really have to look at ways to really do this risk management, adaptation and mitigation, and we see this early action as a key component to that, right? Is acting early to reduce life-saving needs in the future, and building on that livelihoods is just in the next 10 years is going to be so important as we see the impacts of climate really compounding our threats and our risks in humanitarian contexts.
Absolutely, that was a nice closing note, and thank you very much, Ranigan, for being with us so early in the morning.
My pleasure.
And thank you again for all my panelists for bearing with us and staying in the room even after we went way over the time. And thank you everybody in the audience for participating and engaging in the discussion. I would invite you for a round of applause for yourself and also for my panelists for being here all the time. Thank you.